For most of human history, there was no word for the feeling you get when you're staring at a wall, waiting for something, anything, to happen. Here's the part nobody tells you. That gap in the language didn't exist because nobody ever felt it. It existed because the feeling itself was classified as something else entirely, something closer to a sin than a mood. That confusion is exactly why this word had to be invented in the middle of the 19th century, and it's the same confusion that's still running your relationship with your phone right now. Stick around, because by the end, I'll show you the actual sentence, printed in 1852, that gave this feeling a name in English for the very first time. London, 1852. A woman in silk sits in a house with more rooms than she has reasons to enter them. She has servants, a title, a husband who barely speaks to her, and absolutely nothing that requires her attention for the rest of the day. She says 4 words that, in print, had never been arranged in quite that order before. I am bored to death. Not sad, not sick, not sinful, bored. A brand new English word, wearing a brand new English feeling, walking into print for the first time in recorded history. It would take another 150 years and several branches of medicine for anyone to explain what she'd actually stumbled onto. Go back further, and the feeling clearly exists, but it doesn't have a name of its own. It hides inside other words, borrowed from religion and medicine, because nobody had yet decided it deserved a category to itself. Medieval monks had a word for something close to it, acedia, sometimes called the noonday demon, a heaviness that hit them at the exact hour when prayer felt pointless and the day stretched out flat in front of them. But acedia wasn't treated as information. It was a sin, listed in the manuals monks used to examine their own souls, right alongside greed, lust, and gluttony. A monk who felt it wasn't diagnosed with an understimulated mind. He was diagnosed with a failing spirit and told to pray his way out of it. The Romans had their own version, tedium vitae, a weariness with life itself, but it was reserved for philosophers and poets, writing about the human condition in sweeping, abstract terms, not something an ordinary Roman clerk would casually admit to feeling on a Tuesday afternoon. Seneca wrote about it. Ordinary Romans, as far as the record shows, mostly didn't get to have it, at least not on paper. The French, centuries later, developed ennui, a word with a little more room to breathe, closer to what we mean today, but still tangled up with class and philosophy rather than everyday complaint. An aristocrat could suffer from ennui. A farmhand simply worked. What none of these older words did was separate the feeling from morality or social rank. If you were restless, empty, or listless, the explanation lived in your character, your soul, or your standing before God, never in your circumstances. Nobody thought to ask the plain, almost insulting question of whether the problem might simply be that nothing interesting was happening around you. That question didn't have permission to exist yet, because admitting boredom meant admitting your life, not your character, might be the thing at fault. There was also, quite simply, less structural opportunity for the modern version of the feeling to exist at all. Most people before industrialization spent their days doing physically demanding, constantly varying tasks tied to weather, harvest, and daylight, with survival itself as the built-in source of urgency. A field that needs weeding today and a roof that needs mending tomorrow doesn't leave much room for the specific, modern flavor of emptiness that shows up only once basic survival stops requiring your full attention. The feeling had to wait, in a sense, for enough people to have enough spare, unstructured hours for the gap between alertness and stimulation to become a common daily experience instead of a rare, aristocratic curiosity. What most people never realized is that psychologists don't classify boredom as a form of sadness at all. It runs on what researchers call the desire discrepancy mechanism, a specific mismatch between how alert your nervous system is and how little your environment is actually giving it to process. Arousal stays high while stimulation drops towards zero, and your brain reads that gap as intolerable, not because nothing is happening, but because it's wide awake with nowhere to put its attention. That single mechanism, first mapped by Boredom researchers in the early 2000s, explains why doing genuinely nothing feels worse than doing something mildly unpleasant. The first person to really name that gap without hiding it inside religion was a mathematician who was, by his own account, terrified of being alone with his own thoughts. Blaise Pascal, writing in the 1650s, arrived at a single sentence that would end up defining an entire modern condition 200 years before anyone had proper vocabulary for it. He wrote that all of humanity's problems stem from a person's inability to sit quietly in a room by themselves. Pascal wasn't writing about sin, and he wasn't writing about weak nerves. He was describing a psychological vacuum, one that his own devout Catholic contemporaries would have filed straight under acedia without a second thought. Pascal filed it somewhere entirely new. He treated it as a fact about the structure of the human mind, under conditions of total stillness, not a flaw in the human soul that prayer could fix. He noticed that people would gamble, hunt, chase women, start wars, and pursue careers they didn't even want, purely to avoid the unbearable experience of sitting still with nothing to occupy them. 3 centuries before anyone ran a laboratory study on it, Pascal had already sketched the outline of a mind that would rather suffer than sit empty. He wrote all of this from personal, uncomfortable experience. Pascal was, by every account from his contemporaries, a man who worked obsessively, moved restlessly between mathematics, theology, and engineering projects, and rarely allowed himself the very stillness he was describing. His diagnosis wasn't detached theory. It was closer to a confession, one specific enough that later psychologists studying restlessness would find it more precise, in places, than clinical descriptions written 2 centuries after his death. Before this word ever made it into English, guess in the comments, how many times does the concept of boredom appear, under any name at all, in the complete works of Shakespeare? I'll tell you if you're right by the end. The institution that actually manufactured mass boredom on a national scale wasn't the church, it was the factory clock. Before industrialization, English laborers worked by task and by season. Plant this, harvest that, mend the roof while it's dry, stop when the light goes. The rhythm changed constantly, because the work itself changed constantly. Factory owners in the late 1700s and early 1800s replaced that entire structure with a single mechanical instrument, the clock-in, clock-out shift, identical in January and identical in July. Identical whether the specific task that day was interesting, repetitive, or nearly meaningless. Owners weren't trying to invent a psychological condition. They were trying to standardize output and squeeze more predictable hours out of a workforce used to seasonal rhythms. This decision seemed small at the time. It was not. Uniform clock time, applied to millions of repetitive tasks stripped of variation, created the exact structural precondition boredom needs to exist at scale. High alertness, demanded for hours, with almost nothing genuinely novel to absorb it. Once that clock-driven monotony became the normal texture of daily life, the feeling it produced had nowhere respectable to go, so society treated it as a moral defect rather than an honest reaction to an honestly empty day. Victorian doctors diagnosed bored upper-class women with neurasthenia, a supposed weakness of the nerves brought on by too much civilization, and prescribed rest cures that amounted to locking them in a room with even less stimulation than before. Bored aristocrats were mocked in satirical newspapers as decadent and self-indulgent, on the theory that ordinary laborers were far too busy to ever feel such a thing. Clergy kept preaching against idleness as the devil's own workshop, treating a wandering mind during a church service as evidence of a wandering soul, rather than an understimulated brain doing exactly what understimulated brains do. Popular magazines ran columns mocking fashionable ladies who claimed to be dying of ennui, turning what was, in clinical terms, a perfectly real psychological state into a punchline about pampered idlers with nothing better to complain about. Meanwhile, doctors elsewhere quietly noted that soldiers stationed on long, uneventful postings and factory workers on repetitive lines showed the identical symptoms as those mocked aristocrats, minus the silk dresses and the satire. Nobody put the two groups side by side and drew the obvious conclusion that a life, or a shift, with nothing meaningful to occupy it, produces this exact feeling in a duchess or a dock worker, entirely regardless of virtue, class, or moral fiber. School teachers of the period treated a restless, inattentive child much the same way the church treated a wandering mind during prayer, as a discipline problem to be corrected with punishment, not as a predictable response to hours of copying text without variation. Colonial administrators posted to remote outstations wrote home, describing a specific flatness that set in after months, with no real work and no real company, and their superiors filed it under weak character, rather than an entirely foreseeable consequence of isolation and repetition. Every one of these groups, separated by class, geography, and circumstance, was describing the identical psychological mechanism, and every one of them was handed a different, unhelpful explanation for it. Charles Dickens didn't invent the feeling. He gave it a passport into ordinary conversation. In Bleak House, published in serialized monthly installments through 1852 and 1853, his character Lady Dedlock delivers that now famous line, bored nearly to death by a life of wealth, with no purpose attached to any of it. Dickens took a genuine risk with that word choice. Bored, used this plainly to describe an emotional state, had barely appeared in respectable English print before. Putting it in the mouth of a major character in one of the most widely read novels of the century meant betting that ordinary readers would immediately recognize a feeling they had never before had a polite, secular word for. They did, and they did so almost instantly. Within a decade, bored and boredom moved from a strange new coinage into completely ordinary English, spoken by clerks, wives, and schoolchildren alike, precisely because millions of readers finally had language for something they had been feeling privately, and often guiltily, for years without a name to put on it. Dickens hadn't diagnosed a new disease. He had simply been the first writer willing to say the word out loud in public, at scale, and let his readers recognize themselves in it. The gamble paid off specifically because Bleak House was published in cheap monthly installments, read aloud in households across every social class, not tucked away in an expensive single volume for the aristocracy alone. A clerk's family paying $1 a month for the next chapter encountered Lady Dedlock's complaint in the same breath as a countess did, and both recognized the same private feeling in her 4 words. That reach is what turned a novelist's word choice into a permanent addition to the language, rather than a clever line that faded with the book's fashion. Once industrial labor had spread the clock-time rhythm across an entire country, and once print culture had given the resulting feeling a respectable, secular name, the two forces began feeding each other directly. Cities filled with people performing repetitive tasks stripped of variety all day, then went home each evening to hours with nothing structured to fill them either. Urban life offered proximity to thousands of strangers without offering genuine occupation for the mind, crowds and empty hours arriving in equal measure, every single day. The word spread exactly as fast as the condition it described, because the condition itself was multiplying under industrial and urban conditions faster than anyone in 1850 could have predicted. Nobody thought this needed solving. It turned out everyone needed it solved. What happens next is the part of Lady Dedlock's 4 words most people never hear about, because the story doesn't end with a Victorian novel. It ends somewhere much stranger and much closer to your own life than you'd expect. If you want to see how this ends, subscribe now, because the next part changes everything you just watched. By the 20th century, boredom had stopped being a literary curiosity and started showing up in medical and psychological records as something with measurable, sometimes serious consequences. Researchers studying British civil servants in the long-running Whitehall studies found that people who reported chronic boredom at work carried noticeably higher risks across several major health outcomes over the following decades, even after controlling for how objectively stressful their actual jobs were. Boredom wasn't sitting quietly next to sadness as a mild inconvenience. It was showing up alongside impulsive decision-making, elevated rates of risk-taking, and problem gambling, because an understimulated mind will reliably manufacture its own stimulation, and it doesn't manufacture that stimulation carefully. Prison psychologists studying long-term inmates found boredom, not fear and not anger, was the single emotion most consistently linked to disciplinary incidents inside those facilities. Because a mind starved of new input for years will eventually take stimulation wherever it can find it, including from conflict with other inmates or with guards. Later research on adolescents found a similar pattern outside prison walls entirely. Teenagers who reported the highest chronic boredom scores also reported the highest rates of substance use and reckless driving, not because boredom made them reckless people, but because their nervous systems were actively searching for anything capable of closing that arousal gap. Military researchers found the same pattern in soldiers stationed on long, low-activity deployments, where rates of minor rule-breaking and disciplinary write-ups climbed steadily the longer a unit went, without meaningful tasks to perform, independent of how dangerous or safe the posting actually was. In every one of these settings, the office, the prison, the barracks, the underlying mechanism was identical to the one Pascal described in his quiet room 300 years earlier. A mind unable to tolerate emptiness will eventually generate its own content, and that content is rarely constructive. The feeling Lady Dedlock had named, almost dismissively, as a complaint about a wealthy, empty life, turned out to be a measurable driver of real damage in exactly the kind of ordinary, unglamorous life nobody in 1852 had thought to study seriously. Today, the word has outgrown English entirely. German has Langeweile, literally, long while, describing time that simply refuses to pass. Japanese has taikutsu, describing an almost identical flatness with its own particular texture. Corporate psychology has invented bore-out as the mirror image of burnout, a formal diagnosis for employees drowning not in overwork but in meaningless repetition, doing tasks so far below their capability that the understimulation itself becomes the injury. Philosophers still argue over what Martin Heidegger called profound boredom, a state he considered one of the very few moods honest enough to reveal something true about existence itself, rather than simply distracting a person from it. And the smartphone sitting in your pocket right now exists largely as an answer to the exact gap Pascal described back in the 1650s, the plain inability to sit quietly in a room alone. We solved that particular problem so thoroughly that researchers now study something they call phone boredom, the strange, secondary restlessness people feel while scrolling through an infinite feed that still, somehow, doesn't manage to be interesting enough. Some researchers have started calling this loop boredom proofing, the constant, automatic removal of every single gap in the day, small enough for the old feeling to slip back into, filled instead with an endless supply of short, low-effort content that never quite satisfies the same hunger Pascal was describing. The irony, largely unremarked on, is that this constant boredom-proofing hasn't actually made the underlying feeling disappear. Surveys of smartphone users report boredom levels comparable to, and in some age groups higher than, the decades before constant connectivity existed, suggesting the desire discrepancy gap itself hasn't closed at all. We've simply built a machine sophisticated enough to keep offering distraction faster than the gap can be consciously noticed, which is a very different thing from solving it. Go back to that London house in 1852. A woman with every material comfort available to her still couldn't find one single thing worth doing with an entire afternoon, and had to invent a word simply to say so out loud. Contrast that with a factory worker the same year, exhausted from 12 hours of repetitive motion on a line, feeling the identical flatness for the exact opposite reason: too much monotonous input instead of too little. Contrast a monk in the year 1300, punished by his order for feeling what they classified as a sin, with a Whitehall civil servant 700 years later, diagnosed with that same feeling as a documented health risk factor instead. Contrast Pascal, alone in a quiet room in the 1650s, describing the problem as the whole of humanity's tragedy, with a teenager alone in a quiet room right now, holding a device engineered specifically to make sure that tragedy never has to happen again, and somehow still finding a way to feel it anyway. 400 years of solutions, and the room is still quiet in exactly the way that mattered to Pascal. Every time you reach for your phone in a quiet moment, you're touching the same gap Blaise Pascal described almost 400 years ago. One sentence, one word invented 2 centuries later to finally name it. One very old feeling, wearing a very new shape. If this changed how you'll notice that gap the next time it shows up, that's exactly why this channel exists. Subscribe, and I'll keep finding the stories hiding inside the feelings you already have a word for, and never once asked where it came from.